Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, Key Insights on Threat Intelligence and XDR, Every Business Needs to Know. My name is Erin Haynes, and I am the Senior Marketing Specialist for Samurai XDR at NTT Security Holdings. Today's webinar is hosted by Jeremy Nichols, the Director of Global Threat Intelligence Center at NTT Security Holdings, and Paul Asagi, the Senior Director of Product Management for Samurai XDR, who will introduce themselves here momentarily. The webinar itself is 30 to 40 minutes, and we will have a Q&A session at the end to answer any questions you may have. We are going to record this webinar for those who can't attend or may need to drop off, and we will have the recording on our website once this webinar is over, and we'll send that link out as well. With all that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Paul.
Thanks, Erin. Appreciate it. As you heard, my name is Paul Asagi, the Senior Director for NTT Security Holdings, looking after the Samurai XDR product portfolio. Today we'll be covering insights from our GTI report into what we believe is our differentiator in the market, our threat intelligence. Not just the data, but also the people and the processes behind the scenes. If you ever wanted to start your own TI capability, these insights you'll get from today may assist you. That will be from Jeremy later on. So let's get into some stats. If you thought as an SMB, why would it be a target? Think again. As you can see, the stats show a staggering 73% of SMBs experienced a cyber attack or a breach. And just under 3/4 of our survey, 82% were made up of ransomware attacks. As we all know, ransomware is mostly indiscriminate and the recovery costly at $3 million on average. To me, it's of no surprise that only 17% of SMBs have cyber insurance. About keeping your business afloat, less about the insurance and the premiums that you have to pay. And while cyber insurance may help you get back on your feet, it only helps you once you become that victim. And speaking of victims, in Australia, if you're an SMB and have been breached, 60% of you will probably close your doors. That's quite high. The Australian Signals Directorate reported this year the cost of cyber has increased by 14%, and that's no surprise. So shouldn't we be trying to create a more cyber threat resilience in our businesses so that insurance is a nice to have? And if you do get that funding for cyber, spend it on increasing the vulnerability management through patching and then monitoring. And if you can afford MDR, it also may be a wise investment. If you can't, there are solutions like what we're talking about today, later on, XDR, that help you get there. And yes, you are at risk to all of these threats and more. Ransomware always gets a seat at the table, especially for SMBs. These days, the attackers are more likely to be a smash and grab. For example, they get the assets exfiltrated as fast as possible, then extort for money, as opposed to being that stealthy, long-term, persistent threat that's in your environment. They don't even bother with encryption these days because it just takes too long. So it's all done pretty quickly. Do exist still. They're hard to identify, or harder to identify and block. But so I'd recommend, in terms of the threat landscape, focusing on the top row if you had to prioritize. And luckily, our industry recognizes the need to change and adapt to these new wave of threats coming on all angles and at all velocities, and hence the emergence of technology such as XDR to assist. So what is threat intelligence? It's detailed, actionable information used to prevent and combat cybersecurity threats targeting an organization. It's created by gathering raw data from various sources, such as security feeds, forums, dark web monitoring, and malware analysis, if you have the capability, and contextual understanding that's applied to help identify and then prioritize those potential threats. You'll hear more from Jeremy on this important capability we have built in NTT. So what is XDR? It's a cloud-delivered tool that integrates and correlates data across multiple security layers, such as endpoint devices, networks, applications, and of course, cloud environments. It aims to provide a more comprehensive and unified view of potential threats and incidents that traditionally other tools operate in and typically in silos. XDR combines all of these signals together to create the higher fidelity or stronger signals that create that contextual awareness and allow you to respond with confidence and at speed. Then from the front end of XDR, some key elements. These include the integrations such as your EDR, cloud, network, identity, and email, mainly using APIs, but also some legacy transports. In the back end, we have elements that include your detection and response using AI and ML, and of course, threat intelligence, all used to detect threats to ultimately facilitate an incident response process, with tools, yet again, integrated into XDR. Then there's the automation, which is a subset of SOAR, but aligned to threat detection and response. Think of this as the R in XDR. And other elements in XDR include analytics. So XDR empowers small teams and SMBs due to its cost effectiveness and ease of use. Of course, there are automations that may be specific to your business, but the good news is, unlike some SIEM vendors, you don't need to worry about creating and maintaining complex rules and the plumbing of various threat intelligence sources. Being cloud, most XDRs have also adopted pricing-based consumption models and include a nominal amount of data retention, so you can perform those retrospective hunts and searches we all know and remember that we wish we had during attacks such as SolarWinds. So let me caveat, of course, we do love SIEM, just like any other data source. XDRs don't suggest to replace your SIEM, or we don't. Not initially anyway, but to leverage it and use the wealth of content and processing in these environments, such as performing remote. Now let's talk a little bit more about threat intelligence and why we think it's NTT's differentiator in the market today. Most cybersecurity practitioners know the benefits of threat intelligence, how to access it. This includes your open source and your commercial sources. The open source is free and does contain great content, but also some content that should be used carefully or not taken as gospel, in that it requires some validation. The commercial sources will be of higher credibility and accuracy, but with a large price tag, and probably not within reach of many SMBs out there today. Then there's the restricted information sharing groups. These have even higher fidelity, but are mainly accessible in a give to get model. If you don't have something unique to offer or provide back into the community, it's likely you won't get access to this information. We're fortunate enough to be part of these groups in NTT. Then there is what only we in NTT have access to. That is threat intelligence developed from our clients and our tier 1 global internet backbone we call GIN. With GIN, we have 40% coverage of the internet. Now, this vast amount of data, over 10 terabytes per day, is analysed continuously to develop some unique indicators not seen by any other vendor or company. This alone, we believe, is a real differentiator to our platform. We don't sell our threat intelligence, but the good news is it can be accessed via Samurai XDR. And with that, I'll hand over to Jeremy to take us through into the GTI report and how the global threat intelligence we leverage in our platform every day. So over to you, Jeremy.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Aaron, for the intro earlier. As Aaron mentioned, my name is Jeremy Nichols. I'm the director of the Global Threat Intelligence Center here at NTT Security Holdings. So today we'll talk about some of the insights from our 2024 Global Threat Intelligence Report, as well as some of the functions of the Global Threat Intelligence Center and how that supports our Samurai XDR platform. So before we dive into the annual threat report, I will mention that it is available for download on the security.ntt website, and it does include a lot of additional data and viewpoints that we won't be able to dive into too deep today, just because of the time and the PowerPoint format. The data covered both in the report as well as the slides here today is from the calendar year 2023. But really the summary is that we're seeing more incidents, we're seeing higher severity incidents, but at the same time, cybersecurity professionals are really lagging behind because they're stressing to keep pace with more responsibilities, bigger job complexity, shrinking and stagnating budgets. We've long talked about the skills gap in cybersecurity, and that just continues to grow every year as we start to see more fatigue and more burnout as everybody's tasked with more responsibility, an expanding tool set, more incidents, higher severity incidents. As I mentioned, it's just becoming kind of this perfect storm that's keeping it very unmanageable for analysts to stay on top of. So as we do every year, we took a look at the top attacked sectors, and this is based on our customer insights for the attacks that they're observing. And this past year, we saw very little shakeup in the top 5, which is relatively common. We typically see a shift in the types of attacks, a little bit of a shuffle in the top 5, but there's not really a drastic change, especially kind of in the, since the COVID world, right? We've seen a very heavy targeted attack against manufacturing, technology, and transport and distribution. Those remain in the top 5 year over year as we continue to see those attacks against critical infrastructure and supply chain prioritized by adversaries. So those continue to face significant risks as we've seen for the past several years. This past year, manufacturing did move into the top slots as we did see a continued surge in attacks against entities actually manufacturing components for the energy and mining industries, as well as the construction industry. We did see technology dip a little bit this year down to number 2, but they still made up over 20% of the attacks we did observe. And in particular, that was targeting technology and service providers. So really going after those that supply chain approach where if you can compromise one of those technology or service providers, you can typically access at least something from the customer perspective, right? Either the client list, customer data, or potentially access to the customer environments themselves. Finance is always a prime target for financially motivated actors. They did regain a spot in the top 5 this past year after a dip in prior years. So we've continued to see that those targets against the supply chain, like I mentioned, especially in the kind of the post-COVID world, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we've seen that shift in attacks and the vulnerability and lifecycle management as organizations have struggled to keep pace with all the changes that have been involved with that. From the malware perspective, we took a little bit different approach this year, and as opposed to looking at simply the malware families and the malware variants, this year we actually just looked at the tactics, techniques, and procedures that was observed from the detection perspective when these came across. So a little bit different approach than focusing heavily on, hey, here's the top 5 malware families that we saw, because in a lot of cases, that's really commodity malware. It's being distributed by botnets or, kind of mass exploitation campaigns. And so what we've seen in the past, in some cases, is folks tend to hyper-focus a little bit on the actual malware, make sure, hey, I'm blocking these 5 hashes or these C2 that I know are associated with this malware family. And that's, absolutely critical. That needs to be done. But at the same time, I think if you only focus on those top 5 or 10, you're missing a lot of the other stuff that's going to kind of knock on the doorstep, right? So we continue to see this evolution of malware, different approaches to gain that initial access, evade detection, maintain persistence. No longer is it, one binary, one malicious binary has one function. We're starting to see that modularized, everything has multiple functions. Some of it can be swapped in. You could change payloads very easily, change C2 very easily. And so we didn't want to focus on the specific malware, but rather the approach and those tactics and techniques. This year, we definitely see continued increase in the info stealers and Trojans, getting in, getting data out, not necessarily as focused on just financial data, as we've seen in the past. There's definitely the focus on crypto stealers and obviously the banking and financial information, but stealing any of the information from the host. Ransomware, we're not actually encrypting, but we're simply exfiltrating data with the goal of extortion. A lot of different approaches being taken in the past year, and you can see that's represented pretty well here, right in the top 10. The highest was under 13% of the distribution of techniques that we observed. So that modularization, we continue to see that approach where leveraging different pieces living off the land. It just highlights the need for organizations to be able to not just detect, but also be able to hunt for these different techniques and TTPs of the adversaries and of the malicious binaries, because it's not as simple as ensuring you're protected against one specific malware family. You need to be able to catch the different approaches or the multiple stages of that. Whereas there's an exploitation, a dropper, or a loader is downloaded, and then we get second and third stage malware and payloads. So we need to be able to cover that holistically as opposed to focusing simply on the really tactical information, those hashes and IP addresses and domains. Shifting over to the vulnerability intelligence side, this is an area it feels like we preach every year, right? We need to ensure we have proper patch management. We need to ensure we're patching quickly. We're remediating any vulnerabilities within the environment. But I think that's really a simple concept at its core. But there's quite a bit of nuance that often gets overlooked, right? And a small gap in that process can really leave the attack surface and the organization exposed. So we commonly see pitfalls with improper asset discovery and management, both internally and externally. And shifting back to what I mentioned with kind of the shift with COVID, right? A lot of organizations moved to complete remote workforce or a hybrid remote workforce where we had to stand up additional VPN endpoints, we had to open up additional access for remote employees, and a lot of that had to happen so quickly that a lot of it was overlooked, or those programs weren't quite as mature as we thought they were. So maintaining that up-to-date inventory, establishing and enforcing software and version restrictions, proper prioritization testing of those patches, and then properly assessing that supply chain. There's a lot of common pitfalls that we see in this area, especially with this shift that we've had in the past several years of enabling remote workforce, beginning of the return to the office, understanding what was established during that time frame, or what still needs to be decommissioned, what's out there, what's not being maintained. Those all leave kind of cracks in that armor that we need to make sure are accounted for, but also properly assessed when we're looking at the vulnerability intelligence. And I think it's an area of threat intelligence that's often overlooked because it's, like I mentioned, at its core, such a simple concept. But there's a lot of different things that you can leverage to help you with that prioritization of the patch management, or if nothing else, help you decide what needs patched first and foremost, right? Because we know it's actively being exploited. We know it's high severity. Ransomware operators are using it. Whatever that criteria is, there's several different feeds or open source tools that can give you some of that insight into the vulnerability process. We covered a couple in the report here, but you can see CVEs are going up every year. The top vendors that have CVEs announced are typically the ones that we see with the biggest market share, or they have the highest reputation. That's kind of the expectation. It's the old chicken or egg. Are they the most? Do they have the most vulnerabilities because they have the largest market share, or are they really the most vulnerable? And typically the answer is somewhere in between there. We've seen an explosion of different software and vendors, so no doubt we'll continue to see those CVEs rise year over year. We have seen, additional vendors, software as a service, remote management tools, those becoming key targets. You've seen a lot of high-profile vulnerabilities in 0 days with VPN, firewall, and endpoint solutions as well in the past year. Any of those entry points, especially with the very popular software, the remote access tools, VPN and different of the tools since we've gone to the remote workforce. Those have all skyrocketed towards the top of that list. As we get into ransomware, we saw quite a bit of shakeup here as well, and really kind of a banner year for ransomware. We saw the highest number of victims ever posted on the double extortion or kind of name and shame sites or in the social media channels, as well as the highest volume of payouts to the ransomware operators, with over $1 billion paid in ransoms last year. So very little changed at the top of the charts. We did see the United States of manufacturing as the number one in terms of victims posted in this past year. That's been the case for the past several years, as long as we've been tracking this. The top targets did tend to be organizations that need kind of that near perfect uptime, right? Manufacturing, technology providers, financial organizations, retail, and healthcare. Those need to be operating at 99.99% uptime. And so any disruption to those services, whether it's the actual encryption disruption or whether it's the extortion and brand loss, reputation loss, and potential disruption of business, those organizations tend to be targeted the most by these ransomware operators because they know you're more likely to pay the fine if you can't face any downtime, right? Lockbit did claim the highest number of victims for the second year in a row. They were in top 3 in 2021 before that. You see a lot of different operators here, mostly ransomware as a service at the top. Saw great success in the past year. Excuse me. We did see a few of the operators operate with more of kind of that big game hunting style, right? Going after the larger organizations. A couple payouts will equal the same as 100 payouts from smaller businesses. So I think Clop kind of encompassed that perfectly with a couple zero-day exploitation campaigns. The most popular is probably Move It. But over half of their victims actually had over 1,000 employees. So, moderately to large size businesses were really the target there. So higher payouts and generally higher profile companies tend to be able to handle the reputation impact a little bit more, but some of those are going to be more likely to pay the ransom to ideally keep that under wraps or keep that data from going public. We did see a couple operators shift tactics and actually start trying to leverage regulatory policies and federal agencies to increase the likelihood of payment. So in the United States, we have the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, you need to file a claim with them if you've had a breach to publicly disclose that. We saw an operator actually threaten an organization, hey, haven't seen you file that claim yet. We can go ahead and do it on your behalf. It's going to go public, just trying to basically extort them into paying that ransom. We saw the same in Europe with GDPR. If you don't pay the ransom, we're going to report you. You're going to get a bigger fine. You might as well just pay the ransom. So actually trying to leverage those compliance and federal regulations to increase the likelihood of getting that payout. We've also seen some operators target industries that historically were considered off limits. So aviation, healthcare, nonprofits, energy like oil, gas, and water. Historically, those, especially with the ransomware as a service operators, those industries were off limits. It was in their rules and their bylaws. You do not target them. If you target them, typically the ransomware operator would give them a decryption key for free. You're kicked out of their affiliate program. You're not getting paid for that. We've actually seen those rules relax or simply not followed, even if they're posted, right? We saw an increase for healthcare and nonprofit, more than 2 times as many victims last year as we saw in 2022. And then aviation and energy saw more than a 50% increase. So a lot of those that historically were kind of, off limits because they have a potential impact on, on life or on the environment, we've kind of seen those rules thrown out the window by some of these operators. We've also seen a few groups cross that moral line in addition to the criminal line they're already crossing with, the ransom and extortion operations. I actually saw a couple groups try to extort individual patients or customers of the breached organization. So no longer is it, hey, I breached you, you had poor security, you need to pay me a ransom. Now we're actually targeting the customers of that organization in addition to the organization itself. So trying to extort the organization for a payout, but then going after hundreds to thousands of individual customers or patients to try to get a much smaller ransom out of them. So really, really getting across that moral line. This is no longer just about financial gain, which you were getting from the organization if you were getting that ransom paid. Right now, we're targeting individuals and civilians on top of the organization. And it's not just the big game hunting. It's not just the, the critical infrastructure and some of those sensitive industries. We're seeing a lot of SMBs targeted here as well. I think we noted in our report, but over 50% of the victims we tracked had less than 200 employees. So that I think on the year we had just over 5,000. So that's over 2,500 victims of these ransom and extortion attempts were organizations with under 200 employees. And then over 2/3, I think it came out right around 68% had less than 500 employees. So, very, very small organizations being targeted here. Even if the ransoms are smaller, if you can get, 100 or 1,000 organizations to pay you something, it's better than spending all your time fighting with one organization trying to get that ransom and negotiating it down. So we've seen, certainly groups take both approaches, but in this past year we saw, thousands of victims from that SMB realm under 200, under 500 employees. So as I mentioned, there's definitely some additional information in the report. We cover some additional insights on human vulnerabilities, as well as some more information on that ransom marketplace, as well as some predictions and some recommendations. So definitely check that out. It's available for download on the security.ntt website. We also release quarterly infographics, which cover some similar information, but those are updated throughout the year. Also available on security.ntt. So a few of the insights from the report. Now we'll talk about the Global Threat Intelligence Center. So what is the Global Threat Intelligence Center, or what is the GTIC? The GTIC is responsible for threat research, detection engineering, and intelligence publications under the NTT Security Holdings. We manage and support the Global Threat Intelligence platform, as well as the research and analysis environment. So essentially the end-to-end intelligence production into the GTIP, into the output of those publications, and then in collaboration with several other teams across NTT, the SOC, our CISO group. We maintain all those partnerships and alliances that Paul had mentioned, those restricted information sharing groups, ensure we're contributing, ensure we're consuming, and conducting research based on the findings of those contributing members. And then we help facilitate that internal collaboration and sharing between the research teams, the SOCs. We help balance the long-running research with the boots on the ground insights that they're getting from whether it's day-to-day research and analysis and incidents from our customers, whether it's DFIR engagements or consulting engagements, or whether it's internal protections and insights across the NTT operating companies. We help coordinate and share across the different teams. So what's that look like from a Samurai XDR perspective? So if you've seen any intelligence presentation, you've probably seen a very similar diagram or very similar flow to this with the collection, processing, exploitation, analysis, production, and integration and sharing steps. We do follow a pretty traditional approach, consume structured and unstructured intelligence, whether that's blog posts, whether that's PDF reports from partners and alliances, or whether that's structured threat intel feeds of peer IOCs, or a structured feed that's in a JSON or a STIX format, right? That all comes in, that's normalized, deduplicated, brought into our standard format. Processing exploitation takes place where we add all of our standard tagging, updated to industry standard nomenclature. So we leverage MITRE ATT&CK, traffic light protocol, NATO Admiralty. All of that is industry standardized. The team conducts their analysis and production for that output, whether that's for detection purposes, whether it's for monitoring long-running research, whether we can produce some additional artifacts on that, and then that's integrated and shared throughout, depending on the specific criteria that are set up for that. Excuse me. So what really takes this to the next level for us is the reach that we have both through those sharing alliances and the partnerships, as well as just our reach as NTT. But as Paul had noted, that tier one backbone visibility really gives us some additional insight into the infrastructure and the traffic that we're observing for different adversaries, different malware. And I'll touch on that a bit more, but that gives insight into not just what's happening as of today. We have the ability to look back, campaigns that have taken place where maybe we caught it for one customer, but it was targeting many other organizations that we simply either didn't have insight into because of the scope of the customer, or maybe they weren't a customer, they're in a different sector region, but we saw them targeted as well. It gains us a lot of insights into the underlying traffic that's taking place versus strictly what our customers are seeing on their devices themselves. So a couple examples here. We've done a handful of engagements with this where we've participated with law enforcement on disruption efforts or other industry partners. But in some cases, we've actually been able to detect malicious hosts, weeks in advance before they were flagged as malicious by other vendors or by VirusTotal. And we do that by monitoring what we call seed data, right? So we have different traffic different traffic patterns that we can profile, whether it's the hosts, the ASN, the attributes of the host itself, but that forms a cohesive picture of the malicious infrastructure, including when it's being staged. It's not necessarily when it's actively in use, when it's being part of a campaign, or when malware is actually reaching out to that C2. We can profile that, the communication behaviors of that in advance and actually find that malicious infrastructure before it's actually being used. As we discover new intelligence, new IOCs, new infrastructure, we can add that to those same monitoring jobs and continue to map that out multiple layers deep. So we're not just seeing the malicious infrastructure, but we're seeing who's communicating with it, whether that's actually a victim or whether that's somebody that has a hand in staging that infrastructure or they're actually controlling it. We could profile that traffic quite a few different ways as well. So gain different, different insights into the actual actor behaviors. So when did a particular campaign actually begin beyond when we saw it, either for a customer or for honeypot visibility, or if one of our partners saw it, right? We could do that retro hunt. Did that actually begin earlier than we thought it maybe did? Are we seeing any other changes to that behavior? Is there any preference towards a certain geography or certain time zone? Is there any frequency to those attacks? Is there a specific target distribution that we need to pay attention to? So it's not just the immediate visibility or very rich log visibility into the attacks, but it's the overall flow, the traffic, the patterns, and the communications between multiple IPs in the pattern where we can really start to form a picture of what's happening behind those scenes. And then similar to that approach where we find out new malicious infrastructure, we want to monitor it, we want to find out who's talking to it. We also have the ability to do essentially the same analysis historically. So if we discover a campaign that has been ongoing for a month or had already happened, data was exfiltrated, we can actually look back historically and find out, did that happen to, were there other victims? Has it actually happened for a longer duration than we even believed or what's publicly known today? So especially useful when details emerge about something, an unknown campaign or a 0-day or mass exploitation campaign, we can look back and find, were there other unreported victims? When we enrich that flow data, is there any focus for the adversaries? Are they targeting a specific sector? Are they targeting a specific country or region? Did the campaign begin before it was initially believed to have begun? So a lot of different viewpoints and insights that we can gain from that backbone data. And again, all of that's available to the XDR customers through the intelligence integration. And this is just a quick kind of example of how all of that flow works, right? But the product of all of that research and the intelligence production is available to all of the customers of Samurai XDR. And that's not just those immediate indicators, right? So I've talked about the flow data. I've talked about consuming the structured and unstructured intelligence. It's not just that immediate, indicators of compromise. This is a bad hash. This is a bad IP. This is a bad domain. Those are great. They're important to note. They're not the highest fidelity for detection purposes, right? So this also includes the sharing of additional artifacts, PCAPs, the flow data, anything that we can use to support that training and testing to validate the coverage of detections, ensure we have proper controls in place around, the patterns of behavior, not just hey, we communicated with this IP, but was there a certain sequencing? Is there certain behaviors or attributes of that communication pattern that need to be included with that? So enhancing that threat detection, faster response time, reduce false positives, all of that's available through the Samurai XDR platform, And that comes through not just the insights gained from that flow data, the insights gained from our SOC analysts and our feeds, but it's that consolidated intelligence that's being produced as a result of all of those insights, right? What our SOC is seeing, what the GTIC is seeing, what our partners and alliances are seeing, putting all of that together, leveraging the backbone data, all of our commercial tools to paint that picture and give us a much better viewpoint into that threat landscape. So with that, I will hand it back over to you, Erin.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and talk a little bit here, and while I'm wrapping this up, if you want to publish any questions that you have, feel free to write those in our question box. Samurai XDR SaaS, free 30-day trial, no credit card required. If you go to our website, samurai.security.ntt, you can sign up there. And up next, we have our next webinar coming up, Why Identity is Crucial to Cybersecurity, on Tuesday, July 30th at 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Okay, so now for some questions. The first question we have, Jeremy and Paul, is my company uses identity management, antivirus software, and firewalls. Do I really need an XDR?
Yes, in short. Well, yes, depends. It depends. But I would say yes if you want comprehensive coverage, because each of those products themselves typically work in isolated fashion. Sure, you may have an antivirus endpoint solution that's deployed on your device, and that device authenticates to central identity management solutions. But typically, those two types of environments don't cross-communicate. And when we talk about the benefit of XDR, it's really about the telemetry from your ecosystem, your security controls, and other assets in your environment that are important to you. And really what you want to do is bring them together on one side and antivirus software on the other side, each doing what they're supposed to do, which is detect viruses and malware, make sure there's an identity who's being authenticated and authorized. They may have their own detection capabilities. Well, definitely with antivirus software, it has its own detection capabilities. But in an identity management landscape, there are detection capabilities, but that depends on the vendor that you're choosing. But really what you want to do is make sure that if an identity is authenticated or hasn't been authenticated, and you see some suspicious activity on a laptop, and let's say it's the antivirus software flagging that, tying those two pieces together will give you more context and I guess a more high fidelity alert to work with, because both of those systems have seen a significant or a threat occur and events occurring, and the correlation and the timeline of stitching those two events together in an XDR, which is automatic, by the way, will actually increase that, the fidelity and potentially the threat, which then prioritizes it in your app, in the XDR app, so that you can actually deal with it. So I'd say yes, it does. Each of them on their own are great, and they do a great job at bringing them together. That's the whole idea of it, the way XDR was born. It's that extended detection piece, extending it from just siloed devices or siloed systems. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Okay, great. And then here's another one. Is there a proactive way to reduce vulnerabilities for the increased attacks you mentioned?
I think that's a bit of a Jeremy one and a bit of a Paul one, but I'll let Jeremy have a go at this, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it gets back to the, excuse me, the vulnerability lifecycle management and patch management programs, like I had mentioned. The best approach is don't be vulnerable, right? But the answer to that is unplug from the internet. So the important thing is make sure you understand your attack surface, make sure you understand what's running on the network, what vulnerabilities exist, and then properly prioritize the patches against those. And so we would typically recommend leveraging intelligence feeds based on vulnerability insights that can help you with that patch management program. So understanding what CVEs, what vulnerabilities are actively being exploited in the wild, which ones are being integrated into botnets and commodity malware, which ones are being leveraged by ransom and extortion operators. Those will immediately cut down on that surface, right? That attack surface, because those are the ones we know are actively going to have people knocking at the door all day, every day. There's other vulnerabilities you absolutely need to patch, remediate as soon as possible, but you have to be able to properly balance and prioritize those. And so leveraging some of that vulnerability intelligence to do so. The United States CISA offers a known exploited vulnerability catalog. There's several other open source and commercial feeds for vulnerabilities, their severity, what product and application they leverage. Try to tie that in specific to your environment, and then properly prioritize based on criticality and what's being exploited.
That's what he said.
Okay. Thank you both. Here's another one. How does XDR help us reduce false positives and improve the accuracy of our threat detection?
Okay, I'll take that one. Sort of two questions, but very closely related. Like improving the accuracy of threat detection. And it does that by not necessarily reducing the false positives that come out of technologies that create detections. Of course, XDR has its own detection capability based on anomaly detection and rules engines and so on. But reducing the false positives, increasing the detection is all about one, getting the right telemetry into the environment, normalizing that so that it's in a common format, so that we can make sense of that information that's coming into the platform, and then obviously process it with our AI and ML. But reducing the false positives is all about increasing the fidelity or the signal strength of an alert or a threat, and that is about the alert. Did it trigger multiple alarms, like an alarm system you might have in your house? An intruder's trying to break in, they knock on the front door. Okay, well, maybe that's not a threat I need to pass on, but they open the front door, they knock on the front door, and then there's another threat, which is motion detection inside the house. Now, those two threats together clearly going to be something you want to respond to. And XDR is all about bringing all of the threats together and weaker signals, and maybe which could be false positives, as in the person was knocking at the front door, they were a telesales, they left, no one answered. False positive, right? But once the action sort of progressed and someone is found to be in the house, or there's movement, then that creates a heightened sense of a threat. So XDR brings that together, prioritize or deprioritize based on those coupled alerts, and sometimes an alert on its own, based on its CVE score and the information that Jeremy just mentioned. Is it actually been seen in the wild? Is that signature that's come through that credible source? Let's say it's a firewall, a really good next generation firewall, and it can guarantee, well, with high levels of surety, then that alert should be processed and will be processed, and it will honor the level of threat that it's actually been assigned. So pass through what's good, things that are weak signals, deprioritized, or get the contextual information such as threat intelligence to provide some levels of, higher signal strength, is what I mentioned before. So that's how XDR does it. And yeah, it's reason why we're talking today, because we're pretty excited about it.
Okay, great. Another question, Paul. One problem with XDR seems to be cost and complexity to implement and manage. How do you address this?
Okay. Well, XDR addresses it, and then we address it in another way from our product perspective. Typically, security solutions such as threat detection type solutions have been pretty technical and hard to implement. The charter or the mission for XDR is to make it simple and make it cost effective. So that's some part of the the background behind why XDR was born. It makes it easier to implement or reduce complexity, being a cloud delivered service. All of the components that you need, or you actually may have, as separate security services in your environment are brought together And you can just basically consume that. Like if you've ever signed up for software as a service, it's really simple. You know, you click on the invitation, you follow out a few steps, and away you go. You've got this environment you can log into. XDR is the same. XDR, or our XDR, is not a physical on-premises tool set. It's in the cloud. It's born in the cloud, and it scales in the cloud. And from the cost side, it follows the same mantra of cloud-based services, which are typically consumption. So you have a cost model that is what you pay for what you use. We actually provide 1 year's worth of storage in the cloud for you at no extra cost, so you can do those retrospective hunts. We also, to meet the challenges, cost-effective price point, and that's how we are driving adoption and sort of like democratizing cybersecurity capabilities in our industry today. Reduce the price, make it easy to use, wizard-based functionality, and basically get up running fast is our go-to-market. Thanks for the question.
Okay. All right. I don't see any more here.
Sure.
So with that being said, thank you all for joining. I'm going to put this other slide up just in case, because when I took over from Jeremy, I'm not sure I was sharing my screen. So thank you guys for joining. We will send this webinar out after we're done with it, so you have a copy of the slide deck. And thank you, Jeremy and Paul. Great job.
Yeah. Thanks for those attending today, and yeah, look forward to seeing you log into our website. It's easy.
There you go. Sounds
super
good.
easy.
Yes.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
All right. Thank you both.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks,
Bye
everyone.
bye. Yep.